You might have heard of a little game called Tetris. After all, it's only one of the most popular, well-known, and best-selling video games of all time, and is usually considered one of the best. Do you know someone who doesn't like video games? Try getting them to play Tetris. They'll sit there with the controller for about 5 minutes, bitching about how stupid it is, and how they'd rather be doing something else, and then they'll quiet down eventually, and they're hooked. That's the magic of Tetris. The story of Tetris is fairly well known. Tetris was created in the Soviet Union by a man named Alexei Pajitnov, who then sold the rights to the game to Microsoft for the Windows version and Nintendo for the home version. Other people, like Tenjin, tried to rip off the game, but got sued into oblivion. Pajitnov became rich, and later founded the Tetris Company, who make all the Tetris games today. Well, if that was all true, accurate, and not missing any nasty details, I wouldn't have much to talk about, right? And I'd have to stop playing the game for the video faster, and that's just not fun. So allow me to blow your brain slightly with a quick rundown of how it really happened. Tetris was actually created by two guys, not just one, and because they were government employees of the Soviet Union, they didn't get jack shit for their efforts. The Soviet Union licensed the game out to way too many people. Nintendo actually screwed Tenjin over, not the other way around. When Pajitnov created the Tetris Company, it also screwed over the other guy, who wound up killing his entire family and himself. And the Tetris Company didn't exist to make games, but rather to act as a watchdog for copyright infringements of the original Tetris concept and collect royalties for sales of a game that was at that point 12 years old. The other guy's name was Vladimir Pokilko, and along with Alexei Pajitnov, he worked with the Dorodnitsin Computing Center of the Academy of Science of the United Soviet Socialist Republic in Russia. Contrary to popular belief, the center was not a game developer, nor were they actively designing a game for the company, but instead the duo were researching the effects of computers on the human brain, particularly in the form of puzzles. The inspiration for Tetris came from an ancient Roman puzzle game, Pentamino, in which blocks made up of combinations of 5 squares in different designs had to be arranged to form a rectangle or square. While working on this, Pajitnov started experimenting with simpler shapes made up of 4 squares instead of 5, called tetraminos, and created the falling block puzzle game simply as a means of amusement for himself. That's right, he did it to alleviate his boredom and basically slack off at work, which is pretty much what Tetris was used for over the next 30 years anyway. The name Tetris is a combination of 2 words known as a portmanteau. It comes from the Greek tetra, which means 4, as in tetraminos, and tennis, which has nothing to do with anything other than it was Alexei Pajitnov's favorite sport. Pajitnov showed an early version of Tetris to Vladimir Pokilko when discussing their mutual research, and Pokilko helped him hone the game's design and added a 2-player mode, and decided to market the game on his behalf. The problem was they were in a socialist society that had a very dim view on concepts such as personal ownership and trading original ideas, goods, and services for money. So the Soviet government reasoned that they owned the rights to Tetris, as it was created by one of their employees on one of their computers, and there wasn't a damn thing Pajitnov or Pokilko could do about it. So Pajitnov wound up signing full rights to the game over to the Soviet Union, upon fear of either imprisonment or assassination, not knowing that he was basically losing $40 million in the process. The Soviets used a company called Elektrotechnika, usually just called Elorg, to market the rights of the game to foreign game publishers who sold the rights to an arcade version of the game to Atari and home versions to Nintendo, while Microsoft generally claimed the rights to the PC version despite never actually dealing with Elorg. The problem was, though, that by the time Elorg had settled the deal with Nintendo and Atari, dozens of other companies also claimed the rights to Tetris and had already released many versions. The reason is because in the interim between the game's creation and the moment the creators signed the rights over to the Soviet government, the game had already spread throughout Europe virally. The game was originally created on a Russian computer called an Electronica 60. Another computing center employee, Vadim Gerasimov, ported over to the more universal IBM PC, which spread virally first throughout Moscow, and then other parts of Russia, and then Europe in general. You can actually still download the IBM PC version of the game from Gerasimov's website, where he credits himself and Pajitnov as the creators, leaving out Pokilko's role completely. only grudgingly mentioning in the article that Pokilko envisioned and created the game's two-player mode. When the game reached Budapest, Hungary, it was discovered by a company called Andromeda, who operated out of the United Kingdom. Andromeda contacted the creators to license the game for distribution, but the creators had already licensed it to Spectrum Holobyte, an American company, who were the first to release the PC version outside the USSR. Not quite licked, Andromeda instead decided to pretend that local Hungarian programmers had created the game and licensed it from them instead, and even unsuccessfully attempted to copyright the game. Meanwhile, the Spectrum Holobyte version blew up in America, another company from the UK. Mirrorsoft was also selling the game in the Western market, claiming that they owned the rights to it. Things didn't get easier when the Soviet Union gained the rights to the game and started marketing the license. Instead, they got worse. At least 6 companies at this point claimed to have the rights to create and distribute Tetris games for PCs, game consoles, and handhelds, while Elorg claimed that none of them had any of those rights and sold exclusive rights to home console versions to Nintendo and arcade versions to Atari. The game's handheld rights were then sold to a Dutch publisher, Henk Rogers, who struck up a deal with Nintendo to create the Game Boy version to be included with the system. Meanwhile, Atari's home console branch, known as Tengen, applied for a copyright to port their arcade version to the NES, which had no versions of Tetris. Nintendo was pissed off because they had bought the exclusive console rights from Elorg, but Atari believed that they were in the right because they had a copyright for an NES version of the game. After a court battle, it was determined that only Nintendo could develop Tetris for the NES, and the Tengen version was killed off, despite the fact that it had already been released and sold for a month. Because of the recall, the Tengen version of Tetris, full title is Tetris the Soviet Mind Game, is considered a valuable collector's item. What's even more amusing is that many people consider Tengen's version of the game to be superior to Nintendo's, as it contained more modes, including several two-player modes, something that was sorely missing from Nintendo's version, which came out after Tengen's Tetris. Sega tried to release their own version of Tetris on the Genesis, or rather the Mega Drive, only in Japan, but due to the massive amounts of lawsuits from Nintendo and Elorg, they also recalled the game, making the Mega Drive cart for Tetris another very rare collector's item. So rare, in fact, that many people questioned whether or not the game was real, or if it was real, if it was official and not a pirated game made in China. Alexei Pajitnov himself confirmed its authenticity, and one lucky game collector even has a copy of it signed by Pajitnov himself. The Tengen NES cart is expensive if you want one. The only box copy I could find on eBay was going for $350. The Mega Drive cart is even more rare, with the asking prices going from anywhere from $100 for reproduction carts made in China or Spain to $16,000 for the real deal, from Japan, in the box. And that copy I told you about that's signed by Alexei Pajitnov, that's actually on eBay for $1 million. If you want to look at it yourself, the sale should still be up on eBay until January 5th, 2012, unless some millionaire goes ahead and buys it. The eBay auction number is 130-557-974-178. Anyway, one last thing to talk about, and that's the Tetris company. The rights to Tetris have been almost cleared up at this point. If you didn't get it directly from Elorg, you got sued. Eventually the rights bounced around and it got sold some more, but that's not really important. What is important, though, is that the original creators got no money for any of this other than their meager Soviet paycheck. The Soviet government promised them that they'd revisit the issue of issuing royalties to the creators after 10 years. But if you believe they had any intention of ever paying, well, then there's a bridge in New York that I happen to own, and I would be willing to sell it to you at a bargain price. But the issue never came up, as in the interim, the Soviet Union was dissolved. Though you might think of this as them getting screwed over again, the fall of communism in Russia was not only good for the world and the country in general, but it was great for the Tetris's creators. At least it was great for Pajitnov and Rogers, who formed the Tetris Company in 1996, after the rights defaulted to Pajitnov after the Soviet government ceased to exist. They left out Vladimir Pokilko, who founded the company Animatech, which was unable to compete and had started losing money fast. It's a tragic and unfortunate end to Pokilko's story, as the mounting pressure of his financial problems and knowledge that he could have been a millionaire caused him to just up and snap, and one night in 1998 he murdered his wife and 12-year-old son using a hunting knife and hammer, and then committed suicide. The only note he left simply said, "I have been eaten alive," which he signed Vladimir. He also added a postscript saying, "Just remember that I exist," which he signed the Devil. Although what he did was horrible beyond comprehension, I urge you to have at least some small measure of sympathy for the man that created two-player Tetris and received nothing for his efforts and was screwed over first by his government and then by his colleagues. I can't condone his actions, especially dragging his wife and son into it, but I can at least feel sorry for the man, at least a little bit. As for the Tetris Company, they mainly exist to police unauthorized versions of Tetris and Tetris clones and rip-offs. Some see them as champions for creators' rights, while others see them as a bully stifling the creativity of independent game developers. Pajitnov did go on to develop other games, many of them variations on a theme, the theme being falling objects that you manipulate, which started with Tetris. Probably my favorite non-Tetris game of his is Wild Snake, an unfortunately very obscure puzzle game involving snakes that came out for the Super NES and Genesis. His most well-known non-Tetris game is Hexic. That's the game that probably came preloaded with your Xbox 360. So there you have it, the true story behind the long, convoluted, and even violent history of Tetris. Kinda makes you look at the game in a completely different way. Still awesome, though.